So your best player's contract was not renewed in the MLS. Do you just go ahead and sell them now? Do they go and sign with another team? What happens now? We're going to get onto all of that next. Welcome into another video on the channel. This is Chris, the MLS card guy. Today we're going over the minutia of MLS roster moves. So a very exciting topic that I'm sure lots of you guys will love. But it is a very important topic. A lot of roster decisions have come out over the last couple of days. And it's very important to know what you do with your players that don't get re-signed. Are they coming back to the MLS? Do they, go overseas? What do they do? How do they find another team? It's very, very important to understand what's happening with overall roster construction, so that you can not have guys that are free agents at the end of the year that don't get re-signed. Hopefully that's the goal, right? So we're going to go over, today we're going to go over the roster rules. So we're going to go over what happens to players that are outside of contract. And then we're going to quickly go over how new players get added into the league. So there's a few different things that you need to watch out for that are MLS specific that will help you guys once you start to see some of these roster moves over the next 2 months in order to help project starting lineups for next season and build your teams accordingly. So we're going to go ahead and get straight into things here. So this is the full rules and regulations of MLS rosters. So you can see it is quite lengthy. There are a lot of very obscure rules that, quite frankly, don't really affect us. But there are some things in here to note. So I will link this as well in the video for you guys so you can take a look at it yourself. First thing that we need to go over is international player rules. So each team has an average of 8 international player slots that they can use. Those slots can be traded amongst teams. So some teams may have more than 8. Some teams may have less than 8, depending on what their particular, brand of or style of signing players is. One thing to keep an eye on with international players is if you see guys get green cards, that means they're no longer international. They don't take up an international spot. A guy getting a green card is very, very valuable to an MLS team because they don't have to use one of those international slots on him. So if you see guys, so the most recent one I can think of is Stanislav Ivanov from the Chicago Fire. If you see guys like that getting green cards, that probably means that they're a pretty big part of that club's plans, and the player themselves also wants to stay within the United States for an extended period of time, right? Tati Castellanos probably isn't going to go and get a green card because he wants to leave, so there's no reason why he would go and get a green card. Whereas Stennis, even if he ends up transferring to a different team, it probably ends up being inside of the MLS. So just something to keep an eye on there. If you see anything about guys getting green cards or teams wanting to get guys green cards, make sure you keep an eye on those players, because generally those are going to be the core players that the teams want to build around. They're obviously going to try to get as many green cards as possible. But there's interest from the team itself because it is a very costly process, and there's interest from the player themselves because it takes a while to go through it. So you do know that there's interest on both sides of staying in the MLS. So that's the first thing that you want to keep an eye on. So next we're going to talk about what happens to those guys that don't get re-signed, right? So teams cut contracts, players just are out of contract and not re-signed. Teams decline options on players. So what happens to those guys at the end of the season? Now, in season, it's a little different. They do a waiver system, which we don't really need to get into at this point. But as of right now, this is going to be the process. So the first thing that you're going to do, if you see one of your players is not picked up by the team, released, anything like that, you're going to go over to free agents. I can list this list. You're going to try to see if your guy is a free agent. So one of the big ones here that I noticed is Alec Khan, right? Goalkeeper from Atlanta United. A lot of people expected him to be back with Atlanta United. Doesn't really have a chance to start there with Brad Guzan. He's now a free agent. Now, Atlanta are still negotiating with him as far as I understand, but he's a free agent, so he could go anywhere that he wants to. There are a few rules, and I have the rules listed here as to who's eligible for a free agency and then what the actual contracts that they can negotiate are. But really, what you want to look for is if your guy gets released, are they a free agent? If they're a free agent, they can go anywhere in MLS and essentially pick their team. So like a guy like Alec Khan, he can go to Cincinnati. Doesn't have a goalkeeper really. He could go and try at Houston, and they don't really have a goalkeeper. So he would have a lot of options at this point. So maybe he's a guy that you look at maybe trying to pick up. Another one that I saw on this list, and it doesn't really matter if they had an option declined or if they were out of contract. So these are all just free agents. Another one that I saw was Stephen Cleveland. So I got asked about him a little while ago. I don't know if he's good enough to start in MLS, but he is a free agent, so he can go anywhere he wants to within MLS. He can go to whichever club he can negotiate with whoever he wants to. So that's really, really important. That's the first thing that you want to look at, is if your guy is a free agent. To be a free agent, you have to be over the age of 24 and have played 5 years in MLS. So you can see the list here. It's not a huge list by any stretch of the imagination, but there are some guys that did get released that are on this list, like Elia Sanchez, I think is on here. Yeah, Elia is on here. Kellen Rowe is on here. So like some guys that have some legitimate starting potential pretty much wherever they go. Ben Sweat is on here as well. These are guys that are going to get to pick whichever situation they want. So that's a big advantage for the player. If you have not served for 5 years, or if you're not over the age of 24, then you go to this re-entry process. So they have 2 stages, stage 1 and stage 2. And this is a draft, okay? So it starts with the team. Well, first it would start with the expansion team, Charlotte. They'd get their first pick. And then it'll go in reverse order of the standings. So next would be Cincinnati, and then so on and so forth until they get all the way down to the bottom with whoever won the MLS Cup. So this will take place after MLS Cup is over. So I think it's scheduled for like the 14th or 15th, so like the Monday after next week. So this is definitely something you want to pay attention to. Stage 1, which will be 1 day, and then stage 2 will be the next day, I believe. Stage 1 will be anyone who is eligible for this process can be picked, but the team has to then pay them, I think it's $15,000 or 10% increase over their prior salary. So you're looking at guys that are cheaper, typically, or guys that, if they get picked in stage 1, the team expects them to be a starter, 100%. You're not picking a guy in stage 1 and paying him more than another team just decided not to pay him, unless you expect him to fill a significant hole on your team. So stage 1 guys, I would think they're going to be probably starters. Stage 2, the only difference here is, so everybody who didn't get picked in stage 1 is eligible for stage 2. And then the only difference here is you don't have to pay them what they made last year. So you'll see in stage 2, there'll be a bunch of older guys that are on bigger contracts that can still contribute, but maybe not at that price point. They might be a little bit too expensive. So they'll get picked in stage 2. And the clubs can negotiate whatever price they want to. They can bring their salary down. Take a guy like Ramon Abila here, right? On Chope from DC United. He's a decent piece. Came on, scored some goals late for DC United. Never really a starter, though. Could he contribute to an MLS team? Yeah, absolutely. I think he could. Now, is he justifying this $1.1 million salary? Absolutely not. It was the second highest paid player on the team. Now, they got him from Minnesota on waivers, so I would assume that he probably didn't make quite that much, but I mean, I guess it's possible if they had the extra cap room. But a guy like Ramon Abila on Chope, he might be somebody that might go day 2, right? So somebody that's, say, Houston might pick up and say, we want you to be our backup striker. We're not going to pay you $1.1 million, but we think you can contribute. That might be somewhere where you see a guy like Ramon Abila go. As far as the day 1 starters, or the day 1 picks, you might see a guy like Joseph Mora, right? $198,000 isn't really too bad of a contract. DC just happens to have Kevin Paredes, so they have nowhere to play Joseph Mora. So $200,000, don't really want to be paying a backup $200,000. So they go ahead and release him. He will likely be a day 1 pick, I would assume. Pretty much anybody that needs a left back in MLS is probably going to be going after Joseph Mora. So if you see, guys like this getting picked day 1, typically that means that the team wants them to be a starter. All right, so just briefly, we're going to go over different ways that teams can acquire players, right? So if you have a player like, say, Jimmy Mauer that has just, his backup's just been cut, how does Dallas go about adding a new backup? So there's a couple different ways to do it. So just things to keep your eyes on when you see some of these roster moves start to be made. If you see anybody sign as a DP, that stands for designated player. So essentially, each team only gets 3 of these DPs, and they can pay them whatever they want, and they have basically the same salary cap charge. There's different rules for signing young DPs is also incentivized, so you don't pay quite as much for guys that are under 23 and I believe under 20. But basically, you can pay them whatever you want. These are guys that you expect to be stars on your team. So guys like Carlos Vela, like Chicharito, these guys are DPs. And their teams expect them to be starters every day and to perform at the highest level every single day. Next, you have what are called TAM signings. So targeted allocation money is one of the ways that MLS teams can sign players. So these are guys that are below DP. They have to be less than $1.6 million salary. But they are above the maximum salary cap charge, which I think is like $600,000 this year. So anywhere from that $600,000 to $1.6 million range. These guys you expect to be starters. You expect to be really good performers on your team. So we're talking about guys like Jordan Morris, Giassi Zardes is on that list. Paul Arriola's on that list. And I know I'm just naming U.S. national team players. But all those guys actually happen to be TAM signings. So they're not full DPs, right? They could be considered full DPs if the teams have extra if they have extra slots. But the teams can also use targeted allocation money to essentially buy down those players' cap so that they fall under the maximum cap. So these are guys that, like I said, you expect to be starters. If a guy signs for $1 million, he's probably going to be expected to play every single day. Next, you have your U22 initiative guys. So these are like the younger guys that they're starting. This is a newer thing. They're starting to sign a bunch of younger talent from South America, play them for a couple years, and then try to sell them to Europe. It's worked really, really well with guys like Miguel Almiron, P.T. Martinez they made a big profit on. So you're starting to see a little bit more of that. Diego Rossi was also in that mix. So you will see some of that depending on the different teams. Some teams don't really use this yet. But I think something that you're going to start seeing, because it's it's essentially like getting an extra DP. It's super helpful, and you actually get 3 of those spots. So I think you're going to start to see teams really start to try to sign younger players for a lot more money. Okay, so those are the 3 ways that you really sign players from outside the league, right? So if you're going to try and go get a young guy from Brazil, you probably sign him to a U22 initiative. If you're going to go and try... If you're going to go and try a big name from Europe, then you probably sign him as a DP because they probably have higher salary expectations. Some of the U.S. national team players, some of the lower level Europe guys, you can sign as targeted allocation money or TAM signings. So if you're not looking outside the league to acquire new players, if you're looking inside the league, there's a few different ways to do that. So you have your academy, right? So this is probably the number one way that a lot of teams are trying to build now is through homegrown players. Homegrown players are essentially super, super, super cheap. So you can have a ton of them. They can be all over your roster, and they count very, very little towards the actual salary cap. So it's a big incentive to do homegrown players. They also have the super draft, which is guys from college in the United States that they get picked. Normally, you're looking at like the top 10 picks are pretty decent, but then once you get into like the second round, those guys rarely pan out. I mean, some of them do, but rarely, I would say. So you're really only interested in that first round, maybe even only the top half of the first round, depending on the years. And those guys typically take a little longer to get into it, so they'll be like 21, 22, and they'll probably take like 2 or 3 years. But you can go back to past drafts and look at guys that are a couple years in that are starting to get there. Like Nkosi Burgess in Dallas was starting to play a little bit. Tanner Beeson in San Jose was starting to play a little bit. Both those guys were 2020 picks, I believe. So you have your draft, and then you can obviously trade for different players inside the league as well. And then you have the waiver / re-entry that we went over in detail before. So those are the kind of the ways that the teams will be getting new players. Charlotte will get an expansion draft, which we'll have a full video on probably next week, because I think the expansion draft is starting to come up. But we will go over all of that in detail as well. So that was a lot of nitty-gritty stuff that is probably very boring, but it's very important to realize how these rosters are constructed. It's a very complicated league. If you have questions, please reach out to myself. There are other people that also are pretty good with the roster rules as well. So just find somebody that kind of has been around it for a little while, because it is very, very complicated. If you want a little bit of first-hand experience, I definitely would recommend playing as an MLS team in Football Manager. All the rules are completely perfect, and it really gets you into the mode of thinking, how can I maximize the talent on my team? And that kind of that gives you an idea of how MLS teams try to build, how hard it is to bring in international players, and how big of an incentive there is to get them green cards. Once they have green cards, then they're just like everybody else, so you can really almost pay them a little bit more once they have green cards. But I hope that was informative. I hope you guys are kind of starting to get a little bit of the minutia of how this stuff works. As always, follow the Twitter account. We've been very, very active on Twitter the last few days with all the roster moves coming out. That's a big place to also get some opinions from some other guys as well. Like Sorare Prospect is on there. He's obviously a great follow. So I think that is going to do it for the video today, guys. Until the next time, Vamos United.